So welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn session. We've got the pleasure of hearing from Adam. I've had a sneaky peek. I think it's going to be a really enjoyable session we can all learn from. So Adam, over to you, and I can field questions later.
It works, right. So hello everyone. Thanks for attending this session today. This is the second of these talks that I've been asked to give. I think I might have got them the wrong way around. I think the first one was supposed to be on how to write academic papers, and the second one was supposed to be on how to write grant submissions. But Emma, thankfully, has rescued me by rejigging the programme. I know that Alison Cowley spoke to you recently about how to take a structured approach to writing a paper over a number of weeks. And I'm sure that what Alison told you is more structured and potentially more accessible for people starting out than what I could offer you. And so I was trying to think about what it is that I do to offer value over and above what Alison can tell you. And I think it's mainly around accumulated experience. So I've titled this An Old Man Reflects on How to Write Papers. And I'm so old that I grew up listening to music in the 1990s. And those of you that grew up listening to music in the 1990s might remember a song called Everybody's Free to Wear Sunscreen. And the sort of, if you haven't, go and look it up on Apple Music or Spotify. You can still download it. But this is actually the text taken from a graduation ceremony, an American high school graduation. And it kind of opens with these lines: ladies and gentlemen of the class of 99, that tells you how old it is, wear sunscreen. If I could offer you only one tip for the future, sunscreen would be it. The long-term benefits of sunscreen have been proven by scientists, whereas the rest of my advice has no basis more reliable than my own meandering experience. And I will dispense this advice now. So I guess what I'm saying is that most of what follows is not evidence-based. It's just reflections upon what I've learned through several years of writing papers. And hopefully some of it will be of some value to you. Why ask someone like me to do this? Well, I've written a few papers. I thought I'd just look at my Google Scholar stats before I came on here. It's saying 141 articles. I think that's a slight underestimate. These days, I find that I'm writing somewhere between 12 and 24 articles a year. Some people have written more, other people have written less, but through the process of doing that, you learn that there are recurrent things that happen regardless of what you're writing about and regardless of the style of the article. And there are lessons that can be carried from paper to paper to paper and probably apply to most academics or clinicians writing papers regardless of their background. But I was also reflecting as I was writing this today that most of what I'm going to share with you today, and this is actually a tweet I did earlier in the day, it wasn't stuff that I've particularly gleaned over the last 3 or 4 years, but it was stuff I was told to do and taught to do properly by John Gladman back when he was my PhD supervisor back from 2008 to 2012. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you will seem phenomenally basic, but it's taken me the best part of the last 15 years to get most of it right. And if there's anything in here that makes sense, it mostly comes from those kind of sort of stalwart tips that John gave me right back when I was first starting out on. Okay, good. So when I was talking about this before, I was when I was talking about grant writing, I told you to think about impact from the beginning, and I said impact something that's separate from impact factor. It's how your research actually makes a difference in the real world. And I spoke about different types of academic impact, different types of impact. So there's academic impact, which is about changing understanding, changing methods, changing theory; economic and societal impact, which is about changing society and the economy, individuals, organizations, and nations. And then there's different of impact which can be instrumental, about policy, practice, service provision, legislation, and behaviour; conceptual, which is about building understanding and reframing debates; or capacity building, which is about building technical skills and personal skills amongst the workforce. And when you're conducting research or conducting clinical improvement work, you can be trying to achieve any one or more than one of these types of impact. And it's really important to think about that when you start your writing journey. And really, you can sort of synthesize this into 3 overarching questions. Who are your target audience? What do you want to tell them? And how best can you get that message across? Yeah. And when you're thinking about your audience, I mean, we're going to spend much of the rest of this talking about academic papers, because these are the things that people often struggle the most with. And by academic papers, I mean empirical research papers. But there's a number of other ways in which you can achieve impact. And depending upon your audience and what you want to tell them, you might be actually choosing not to write a traditional research paper, but rather to write an editorial or an opinion piece, perhaps a journalistic article in something like the Nursing Times or in the BMJ News section, or in the Health Services Journal, blogs on Specialty Society or Royal College websites. You could even use microblogs, things like Twitter and X. People are becoming increasingly adept at stitching together threads from their research as a way of disseminating through those means. And then there's a whole heap of other things you can do, ranging from infographics, using other forms of social media, policy papers, writing guidelines, attending conferences, to even, sort of more innovative things that people have done, including plays, films, poems, short stories. We've got examples of all of those from the University of Nottingham. And I've even heard of people using flash mobs as a way of drawing attention to and disseminating their research. So really, academic papers are increasingly only part of a range of tools that you can use to disseminate your research. And depending upon the type of dissemination that you're doing, your form of writing will change. But what I'm going to focus on for the rest of today really is the business of writing traditional academic papers, because this is the part that comes, I think, most as a culture shock to people. And it's a part that most people struggle with. But if any of you want to talk about any of these other ways of disseminating work, I've got experience with most of them apart from flash mobs, and I'm happy to talk about that when we get to Q&As. So how do you write the thing? Well, as with all forms of writing, you have to prepare before you start writing. And, one of the things is, once you've worked out what your audience is and what you want to tell them, and you've decided that an academic paper is the way to go about it, you then need to decide what it is that they're likely to read. And commonly you'll find that supervisors and more experienced academics will get very hung up about things like impact factor of a journal. But in reality, the major question you've got to ask yourself is, when you think about your target audience, what is it that they actually read? Yeah, what is it that they regularly look at, and how do you get your message in front of them? And then when you've found out what it is that they read, and you've sort of looked at that target journal, then the next thing you really need to do is to go to the web page of that journal and read about the types of submissions that they accept. And this is a journal that I commonly write for, because I'm commonly writing for people with an interest in age and aging, rehabilitation, and healthcare for older people. And so I would often go to the Age and Aging website, and regardless of the journal you're publishing in, they will have an information for authors section on their website. And that's really where you should be starting before you even really put pen to paper, to understand what it is that they expect. And there'll be some background stuff about the journal. There'll be a heap of useful resources that they want you to look at when you're writing papers for those journals. And it is important to go and look at these resources because but by signposting these to you, they're telling you that these are how they want you to frame your writing, and they will expect you to have read them. So have a look at the resources that the individual journals direct you to, and spend a bit of time reading through the ones that are pertinent to the type of research that you're doing. I mean, obviously, if you've done qualitative research and you've got something there about clinical trials, you don't need to go and read that, but read the bits that are pertinent to the type of research that you're thinking of submitting to their journal. They also have things about article categories, which are the type of articles that they accept. Most journals will accept traditional empirical research papers. Some of them will have a preference for quantitative papers, some qualitative, some mixed methods. But they will have specific guidance on how long they like them to be, how they like them to be formatted. But they will also often accept a variety of other things. Some will accept short reports, some will accept narrative reviews, some will accept systematic reviews, some will have different paper writing criteria depending upon the type of articles you write. So for Age and Aging, for example, which is the one that I'm showing you here, they have different article formatting suggestions for quantitative papers, qualitative papers, and observational papers. And it's really important that you go in and read those so that you know what parameters you're working to before you start. If you're unsure, it's worth reading through a few previous articles which are similar to the type that you're trying to submit from the journal, which have been published, so you can get a feel for the type of formatting that they like and that they accept. They'll have very specific formatting guidance, which will tell you everything from how to structure your title page, how to anonymize your paper, the types of subheadings that they like, whether those are at the beginning, the middle, or the end. And how the form of referencing that they like. And these can really differ quite dramatically. So when I'm publishing for the BMJ, for example, the abstract is formatted very differently, and the discussion section is formatted very differently from when I'm writing for Age and Aging. And the ethics submission part and the acknowledgements and other sorts of bits of housekeeping appear in different parts of the article depending upon the journal preference. So it's really important that you look in the formatting guidance and work out what it is that your particular target journal wants. And it's worth writing your article with a particular target journal in mind so that you don't have to do a lot of reformatting just prior to submission. If you then get rejected by that journal, you may have to reformat prior to submission to your next journal. But if you start with a target journal that your target audience read, then at least you'll be formatting from that from the outset, and that will save you some time immediately prior to submission. It's worth then, again, before you set pen to paper, seeing if there are any particular forms of guidance about how to write the type of article that you're trying to submit. So most of you will be familiar with the consort recommendations, which are the recommendations for writing up randomized controlled trials. And I find that people are increasingly familiar with the PRISMA recommendations for writing up systematic reviews. But there are now reporting guidelines for almost every type of study that has been dreamt of in academia. And these are all drawn together on this website, which is the Equator Network. Equator stands for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research. You can get to it on the QR code that I've put on the top corner of the slide there. You'll see that at the bottom it says there are 630 reporting guidance for different types of research. And so it's really worth having a look at Equator to see what experts in your field think you should be reporting when you're reporting at the type of study. So I've used Consort, I've used Strobe, which is for observational studies. I've used Prisma, which is for systematic reviews. I've used Squire for quality improvement studies. I've used Agree for clinical practice guidelines, and I've also used Ramesses for realist studies. And I do always now increasingly try to look and see if there's a checklist that can guide my writing before I proceed to drafting the paper. Here's just an example of the sort of thing that you get if you click on one of the links on the Equator website. This is the Strobe statement, which is for items that should be included in observational studies. And what you can see is this gives you a very clear step-by-step list of items that have to be included in a high-quality paper in your field. And so it really does help with the writing and helps those of you that are new to writing a paper to make sure you include the relevant things, and those of you that are more experienced to make sure that you don't get complacent and miss important things out. And this is a way of effectively heading off the peer reviewers. Some journals ask you to return, for example, a Strobe statement or a Consort statement as part of your submission. Even if they don't, I recommend it's worth putting it in as a supplementary file or an appendix as a way of showing the peer reviewers and the associate editors that you've adhered to particular reporting standards, and so they don't need to worry about that side of things whilst they're doing the peer reviewing. It's one less thing for them to trip you up on. Another thing to do before you start writing your articles to make sure that you have access to some really good referencing software. As I said before, you're going to start with a particular target journal in mind, but your paper might not get accepted to that target journal. And you might find, for example, that target journal number 1 likes Harvard referencing, journal number 2 likes BMJ style referencing, and target journal number 3 likes Vancouver referencing. And it can be really a pain in the backside to have to go back and reformat your referencing list over and over again. It's also really difficult if you're pulling resources manually off the internet or off of papers to consistently format them according to Harvard or Vancouver or BMJ guidance. And referencing software does all of this for you. There are different types of referencing software. These are the kind of commonly used ones: EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley, and RefWorks, but others are available. I think there's now about 10 or 15 different types of referencing software available. Mendeley and Zotero, and I know for a fact, are open access. EndNote used to require a license for, but I think there is now an open access version of that as well. I would suggest that you get familiar with one, that you install it in your computer, and that you use that to organize your references as you are writing your article. And just to give you an example of how this can make a difference for those of you that aren't familiar, I've long used Mendeley because if you don't know already, if you didn't know already before, the unnameable auditory assistant cut me off earlier in the talk, I use a Mac and I tend to find that Mendeley has better Mac compatibility than some of the other examples here, although it does have a few kind of technical issues that you get used to after a while. Each of these has their strengths and their weaknesses. But using Mendeley, for example, when I'm writing a paper, I can click in that little red box next to the address list in Safari. That will open up a Mendeley reference paper. And if I tick the paper reference and click add, it automatically adds it pre-formatted to my referencing library. Then when I'm in Word, have a Mendeley Cite button in the top right-hand corner under references. You can see it there on the slide that I can click, and that opens up papers and allows me to insert them into the paper in an automatic way. And then at the end of the paper, I can say insert bibliography here, and it will insert the correctly formatted references into the bibliography. And if I subsequently want to change from Harvard to Vancouver, there's just a button that I can change at the top there under citation settings, and automatically it reformats all of my references immediately from Harvard to Vancouver or vice versa. All of the referencing softwares will do this. They just do it in slightly different ways. But I suggest that you find one and that you get familiar with it, and you get to understand its kind of idiosyncrasies over time, because what that then allows you to do is to build over time a database of references. And I now have several thousand references which are relevant to my work in my Mendeley Reference Manager, which are held online in the cloud server. So you can see some of my oldest ones were added as far back as 2012. Now, actually, if I'm writing a paper, I don't always have to go and get the references I need from the internet, because they're already there, the ones that I use often in my Mendeley library. So, work out what the journal wants, get your relevant reporting checklist, and then get yourself some referencing software, download it and become familiar with it so that you can handle your references in a professional and flexible way. And you won't find anybody writing papers on a regular basis who does not use a bibliographic referencing software. So that's just some technical stuff to be doing whilst you're preparing to write the article. So how do you actually go about writing the article itself once you get past those initial steps? Different people do different things, but certainly I've always found it useful, and so do most of my colleagues and most of my PhD students now, to start with the methods and the results. Why do I say this? Well, these are the lion's share of your paper, and they're also the part that you're most likely to have finished by the time you start writing your paper. Your methods will have been included in your protocol. Your results will have come out as a consequence of your research. So these will already be written for you. So a large proportion of the work is already done. Yeah. Thinking about the methods, journal readers tend to be more interested in methods than methodology. So what they usually don't want is large perambulations about epistemology and the nature of knowledge, and whether you've adopted a pragmatist or a realist paradigm. What they're really trying to understand more is what you've done, rather than really getting involved in the nitty-gritty of why you've made complex methodological decisions, because usually your target readership will be other academics or clinicians or policymakers. They will not be methodologists. I mean, obviously, if you're writing a methodology paper, that's different, but they're more interested in the methods than the methodology. But if a method is new or complicated, then spend some time on it. Spend some time explaining it. So I've written a number of realist evaluations. These are becoming more understood over time, but actually, if I speak to clinical colleagues, most of them still don't really fully understand what a realist evaluation is. So I would, for example, when I'm writing a realist evaluation paper, spend a bit of time talking about context, mechanism, outcome, how those things interact, ideas of demi-regularities, and how we construct context, mechanism, outcome frameworks to form a mid-range theory. And I'll do that in quite a pragmatic way, in quite an accessible way, but the aim is to explain enough of my methodology so that people can understand my methods. If I'm explaining something much more straightforward, like a systematic review, which is largely understood by a wide proportion of the readership, then I might not spend so much time talking about methodology, and I'll just explain what I've done. Protocols should really be open access and published prior to you conducting your research. Yeah. So if you have done a systematic review, your protocol should be published. If you're doing a randomized controlled trial, the same. If you're doing a realist evaluation, the same. This is now the standard of how we conduct research. Yeah. And there's a very good reason for this, which is after you've done your research, people want to go back and see whether you did what you said you were going to do. If you can publish them in an open access journal, and there are plenty of open access journals that publish protocols. BMJ Open's an example of a paper that publishes a whole range of protocols. The Joanna Briggs Institute has a website that publishes a journal that publishes open access systematic review protocols and other forms of review protocols. Trials has a whole journal devoted to publishing clinical trial protocols. So if you can get them in an open access journal, so much the better. But if not, then get them onto an open access online repository. So something like Prospero for systematic reviews, something like trials.gov for clinical trials, or something like Open Science for things that may not have a natural home elsewhere on the internet. You should be doing that before you conduct the research. But even if you haven't published it before you conduct the research, it's really helpful to have it online before you write your article. Not least because it gives you something to cite, and it allows you to short circuit a lot of the kind of convoluted detail that would otherwise be in your method section, because you can refer the reader to the protocol article that you've already published. It also allows you, though, to state when, where, and why you deviated from the protocol. Almost nobody, by the time they finished a research project, has done exactly what they said they were going to do at the beginning of the project. And that's because things change over time. Research is, by its very nature, adaptive. But it's good science to have said what it was that you were going to do, and then to state where, when, and why you deviated from the protocol, so the readers can understand the compromises and changes that you had to make. And that's really important to include that in a methods section. And ultimately, your methods section should work like a cookbook. So if someone reads your methods section, they should be able to work out exactly what you did. And if they copied what you did, they would roughly end up with similar results given a similar population. So this should read effectively like a cookbook and allow people to reproduce your results. There should be no sense of mystique or mystery about academic research. It should be reproducible. That's a very good standard of what represents good science. So what about the results section? Well, this is the meat of your paper. You know, if your methods of the cookbook, the results are the kind of the Sunday roast that you've cooked at the end, and it should represent the bulk of your writing. This is going to make up a bigger part of the paper than any other part of the writing. It should be substantial. Yeah, it should be important enough for a journal to want to publish it. Yeah, it should be important enough for your research, for your readers to want to spend some time during their day in order to read it. Which means that you have to be careful about salami slicing research. So salami slicing research is where you take a bit of research that maybe has multiple components and you publish each component of that research separately. One of the challenges if you salami slice research is it leads to duplication in the literature, but another difficulty is it leads to multiple kind of thin and thready papers which tend to be published in lower impact journals and are less relevant to your readership and therefore have less impact over time. So if you can, try to present your results in one big bulky section rather than in multiple small salami sliced papers. But having said that, if a piece of work is humongous, if it is so big that nobody in their right mind would be able to or want to read it in a single paper, then you might want to split it down into multiple papers. We've just, for example, published some findings preprint from the DACHA study, which was a piece of work funded by the National Institute of Health Research to effectively describe how to set up a minimum data set in English long-term care homes. And we had so much data. We had qualitative data, we had validation data, we had minimum data set development data, we had evaluations of individual indices within the minimum data set, and we also had qualitative implementation data. And we were very, very much in favour of writing one big bang paper. But the more we tried to do it, the more we found that it was so huge and so unwieldy that not only were we struggling to present it in a sensible way within the word count and within the limitations of the journal, but we were also struggling to present it in such a way that the reader could make sense of in one sitting. And so we split it down into a sort of minimum data set development and validation paper, which, even though we'd split it down, still had 8 separate appendices which covered 32 pages, and then we published separate papers for the about validation of individual indices and for the qualitative implementation data. And so we did everything we could to try to hold those together. When we were struggling, we split them down, but we avoided the temptation to micro slice things down into micro wafer thin slices of salami, because that would reduce the impact of the paper. Tables and figures are really an important way of presenting your findings in a kind of shorthand or easy to understand way. One graphic, a picture says 1,000 words. But it's really important that they're interpretable, that your readers can make sense of them. So the legends and axes and graphs, for example, are really important. The subject headings, the SI units and tables are really important. Your readers ideally should be able to interpret them without much guidance. If they are slightly more complicated diagrams, so we did predictive diagrams about large population data for fracture prevalence during the COVID pandemic, and we worked very, very hard to make them as interpretable as possible. But even then, they required some explanation. It's really important that you include enough explanation and enough interpretation for your reader to make sense of it. So tables and figures need to be interpretable. Your readers either need to be able to make sense of it. Interpreted, you need to tell them what they mean, or both, and ideally a bit of both. Yeah. And you need to be cognizant about the difference between data and findings. And you will probably want to present a bit of both, but in proportion. And what do I mean by that? Well, data is the raw bits of qualitative information that you gather, if it's an interview or a focus group study, or the raw numerical data that you gather if it is a trial or an observational study, for example. And you're going to want to give your readers some sight on your data, so that they're not, so that they can see you're working effectively. They can see that you did some substantial research that generated some substantial data upon which you're basing your findings. But an academic paper is not just about presenting data, it's also about helping your readers make sense of your data, i.e. what does this data mean? It's about attaching a bit of interpretation to that. And those are your findings. Those are how you've made sense of the data. So in a qualitative paper, for example, you might start by presenting a mid-range theory, which includes a thematic analysis, and that would be an example of findings. And then as you go down, you might have a list of individual themes with supporting quotations underneath them, and that's an example of data. If you were presenting a systematic review, you might have a forest plot, which is an example of your findings, but you might in an appendix have some of the outputs from individual articles or individual analyses within your forest plot that would help your readership to make sense of what the underpinning data were. So present data, present findings, and get them in a proportion that helps your readers to both see your working but understand what it means. Journals, especially in the online era, increasingly accept appendices to articles, and this is a way of presenting bigger and more unwieldy data sets that your readers perhaps can't make sense of in a single article, or that you perhaps can't include in a single article because of the reporting limitations. You might have only 5 tables of figures, but you might, for example, want to present multiple bits of data underpinning that, and your appendices are an option to do that. So your appendices will mostly be to support the methods and results. So as you write your methods and results, you may choose to hive some of these off into appendices or supplementary files. They will include additional explanatory information about your methodology and/or methods. So, for example, if you've had to derive a particular way of working, a particular methodology, that might go in your appendices, or they'll include supplementary tables for your findings or supplementary quotations for your findings. So think about using appendices. Don't be shy of using them. I mean, it's true that that your main findings should be in the body of the article, but it may be that only by putting additional tables or additional data in the appendices can your readers really fully understand what it is that you're reporting. And again, it's very important for them to see your working, i.e. your data, and also your findings. So your appendices will largely be complete by the time you've finished your methods and your results section, because you're not going to be putting bits of your discussion or your background into your methods. So you've written into your appendices. So you've written your methods, you've written your results, you've produced your appendices or your supplementary files. What do you do next? Well, then you write your discussion. Okay, and I write a variety of different types of papers. I do mixed methods, I do qualitative, I do realist, I do trials, I do implementation studies, I do quality improvement work. And it doesn't matter what I'm writing, my discussion only ever has 4 parts. Okay, some journals demand that you format this under slightly different headings, but regardless of that, I still tend to find that a discussion only ever has 4 parts. And if it's not one of these 4 parts, then you probably don't need it in a discussion. The first of the 4 parts is your key findings, and this will be the first thing that you write at the head of your discussion. For example, this large cohort study in UK care homes found that, and then you might have 2 or 3 or maybe a maximum of 4 sentences outlining what your key findings are at a kind of overarching level. Your second section will be how this compares with the existing knowledge base. Now, if there's a big literature in your field, this may say, well, you know, this compares to the following published articles in the following ways. It adds to the articles, or it disagrees with the articles, or it shows that they are wrong. Those are the main things that will happen. Your work will either add to the existing literature or disagree with the existing literature. If there's not much literature, you may want to compare it to guidance, or you may want to just talk a little bit about what the evidence is about current consensus if you're building a completely novel empirical evidence on top of an area where there's relatively limited evidence base. But this second part is always going to be about how you compare with the existing knowledge base. People often find themselves tempted to write something like, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first time anybody has ever done this. Chances are, if you feel like writing that, you're probably wrong, and that someone's probably done it somewhere before. And whenever someone writes that, when I'm writing with them, I tend to take it out. Okay, if the only thing that your article can claim is to be the first time to have done something, then it's probably not. You've probably not thought enough about really what the true impact of your findings are, and you need to think a bit harder about the relevance of this. Yeah, just doing something for the first time is probably not meritorious enough to demand publication. You probably need to state the novelty of your contribution in other ways. The next section is strengths and limitations. I usually start with strengths and then go into limitations, although I've occasionally done it the other way around. What I would say to you is that my limitations section is usually much more comprehensive and substantial than my strengths section. I usually think the strengths should be self-evident in the way that I've written the article. The limitations require to be pointed out. And the key thing is to be frank and open about your limitations. The more comprehensive this section, the greater the likelihood of getting published. If I'm peer reviewing an article and I've peer reviewed hundreds over the years, and I've been an associate editor in hundreds over the years for 3 separate journals as well. If I'm acting as an AE, if I'm acting as a peer reviewer, if an article's got a really meaty and substantial limitations section, I sort of relax. If an article is bombastic about its strengths without being open about its limitations, then I start to get increasingly suspicious that the authors haven't thought sufficiently about the importance of the contribution of their work, and I tend to go back with much more radical modifications, or even I'm more likely to reject an article if the limitations section is underwritten. So spend a bit of time getting your limitations section right. And then the fourth part is conclusions or take-home messages. This is really what you want to leave your readers with. And as I say, it doesn't really matter what type of research you're publishing. Your discussion really only needs key findings, how it compares with the existing knowledge base, strengths and limitations, conclusion and take-home messages. And if it doesn't fit under one of those headings, then it's probably extraneous and surplus to requirements. We'll come back to that in a minute. Don't introduce new data or findings or analyses in your discussion. You sometimes see, particularly inexperienced authors, going, "Oh yeah, and by the way, here is table 5, which is a sub-analysis of the data that we presented in the results section." Do not do this in your discussion. If you are presenting data, findings, analyses, they should be in your results section. If you put them in your discussion section, the peer reviewers are only going to tell you to take them out and to move them up to your results. And then last, I tend to write the background and introduction. And I tend to do this last because people tend to write too much when they write their background and introduction. And if once I've written my methods, my results, and my discussion, I can see that I've only got 300 words left, 400 words left, it gives me a sense of how I cut my cloth to fit when I'm writing my background and introduction. A background and introduction should state the problem, the population that's affected, how it affects that population, the kind of societal impact, the cost, that type of thing. State why the problem is important. State why your research addresses the problem, why it is that you're going about researching it in the way that you are doing, and then finish with your aims and objectives. That's all a background or introduction really needs to do. Okay, the purpose of an introduction is to get your reader from why are you doing this to what you did. Okay, this isn't a textbook chapter. Okay, this is not a kind of comprehensive writing on the history of the development of the intensive care unit, or the history of development of care homes, or geriatric medicine, or rehabilitation, or whatever you choose to write about. This is simply to get your reader from why to what we did. And as I say, particularly inexperienced authors, people that are new to this, tend to write this as if it's a textbook chapter and tend to think that they're kind of educating their readership. That's not what this is about. And if you save your background and introduction to last, it helps you to be economical when you write this part of the paper. You might still find that you need more words than you've left yourself, but at least it helps you be honest about how much space that you've got. And then once you've done all of that, you write your abstract. Now, an abstract will often be the only part of your article that most people will ever read. Yeah, a lot of people will read the abstract, sort of feel that they've got a kind of sense of what it is that your article's doing, and then move on to the next paper. They'll decide based upon what's in the abstract whether it's worth going in and digging in and learning more about the detail. So your abstract's got to be good. It should be standalone. It should present enough about the methods and the results in order for the reader to be able to understand what it is that you did. If this was a trailer for a movie, this would not be the teaser trailer. This would be the full, 1.5 to 2 minute trailer that's out in a few weeks before the film is launched. This needs to give you enough detail about what's happening in the paper as a whole in order for readers to understand what the main findings were. So the rough proportions of an abstract should be about 10% introduction, 10% conclusions, 40% methods, 40% results. Now you can quibble how much goes into the methods and how much goes into the results, but between them, they should make up between 80 and 90% of your abstract, because it's the methods and the results that people come to hear from you about. Yeah, and if this is the only thing they're going to read, they have to know what your methods were, they have to know what you did, and they have to know what you found. Okay, and again, the temptation is to overwrite the background. Don't focus on the methods and the results. People often are asked for keywords when they submit a journal article, and they often say, well, what should I put for my keywords? A good rule is that the reason for keywords, why do journals have keywords? Well, it renders your paper searchable for people doing systematic reviews in the future. It's how bibliographic databases index your paper. And so if you're choosing keywords, it helps to choose keywords that people would expect to see. And one good way of doing this is using the medical subject headings browser, the Mesh browser. This is held by the UK, so the US National Library of Health. You can get to it using the QR code there. You can search the Mesh browser. It's become increasingly searchable over my career. If there are terms that are related to your topic, then you are going to want to use use them. Yeah. If there are no terms that are related to your topic, then you can make up your own keywords. Yeah. And good systematic reviewers will look not just for mesh headings, they will also look for kind of free text keywords. But where possible, try to stick to mesh headings, because those are the types of things that systematic reviewers will be looking for when they go looking for your paper. When it comes to writing the actual body itself, and I kind of trailed this earlier when I showed you my tweet from earlier, and a lot of this is wisdom that I got from John Gladman back when I was writing my own PhD, and I still tell my own PhD students these tips today. One of the most important things is to keep it simple, particularly when you're new to academic writing. You can feel a little bit intimidated about writing a paper for a publication in a journal where the other authors are world-renowned professors in their field, and so you can feel the temptation to try to appear clever by using complicated sentence structures and or theoretical constructs and or long words, and that almost never helps your article to get published. It certainly doesn't help to make your article readable. So remember to keep it simple. John Gladman used to always say, never use the word utilise where you could utilise the word use, which is a way of saying use the simplest word that you can find, use the everyday word where possible. The smartest people make complex concepts seem straightforward, right? There's a reason that Stephen Hawking, for example, became famous. Yeah, there's a reason that the chap that I've temporarily forgotten his name, the chap that used to play keyboards for D. Ream, is now a world famous astronomer, and that's because he makes complex concepts seem straightforward. So the smartest people make complex concepts seem straightforward. So be one of the smartest people. Don't try to look smart, try to be like the smartest people, which means that you need to use your own words. If you write in your own voice, you write better and you gain authenticity. And don't worry excessively about academic linguistic conventions. Yeah, don't try to write like other people that write in your field. Just write in a way that your readers can understand. And people often get a bit tangled up with what tense to write in. A good rule is to write in the past tense wherever possible, certainly whenever you're writing about the past or the present. The present at the time you're writing the article will be the past by the time you've published the article. So the past tense is the best way to avoid tying yourself in knots. The only other tense you should ever really use when you're writing articles is the future tense, but only use that when you're writing about the future. Yeah. This is a skill set. It builds over time. You get better with it and about it the more that you do it. Chances are, if you're writing an academic paper about research, or you're writing a paper about a piece of work that you've done in terms of building a clinical service and evaluating that clinical service, that you haven't done it alone, and that there will be others on the team who have complementary skill sets and more experience that can help you out. So key in this is not to try to do it alone, but to get help. If you've got a big group of authors, you need to agree authorship processes and contributions before you start. Okay, don't wait until the article is about to be submitted to have an argument over whether someone should be included as an author and what their contribution was supposed to be. Okay, you should ideally agree this even before you start the research. Yeah, so sometimes people come to help you with a research project because they think they're going to get co-authorship. If that does entitle them to co-authorship, then people need to understand that that's the case. If it doesn't, people need to understand what it is that they need to do in order to achieve co-authorship. So this should really ideally be agreed before you start the research. But if you haven't agreed before you start the research, you should certainly agree it before you start writing the article. Share drafts early. Don't wait until a late stage to be told that you've gone 100 miles off track. Share your early drafts, particularly if you're underconfident about your directions of travel. If you're presenting complicated data, whether that's qualitative data or quantitative data, consult with experts in your methodology about the data presentation. You might be a clinical expert in the field, you might be a good topic expert, but consult with the methodologists about data presentation. So statisticians about statistical analyses, qualitative experts about qualitative data. Make sure your article is thoroughly proofread by a co-author and or someone not on the authorial team. Don't try to proofread it yourself. Chances are there will be a mistake in there that you are blind to, that you'll be looking at it for the 10th time and you've still not seen it because you are the author and you need someone who's coming to it relatively new in order to pick up your typographic errors. And then the final point to make is that when you've got an authorial team, suggestions are opinions, not gospel, no matter how senior your collaborators are. And you need to decide, and this is part of what you agree at the beginning, which of the first author, the corresponding author, or the senior author is going to have final editorial say. But you need to agree that someone has got final editorial say, and sometimes you have to be firm. Yeah, and if you're quite new to this, sometimes you need someone more senior on side to be firm. So if you're working with a senior professor, you might say, if there's a disagreement about what goes in and what goes out, it will be, I don't know, Professor Gordon that deals with those disputes. But you establish that at the beginning, and everybody agrees to adhere by those rules. Journals are increasingly specific about criteria for authorship. Most reputable journals now subscribe to this thing, the recommendation of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. I must say their website design is a little bit old-fashioned and probably needs a bit of updating, but the content on their website is really good. And you can look at the ICMJE guidance by clicking on the QR code here. That tells you precisely what the criteria for authorship are, and that will include, but not be limited to, having contributed to the research, having contributed to the design of the research, i.e. having a stake in the underlying intellectual property. But it will definitely include having reviewed the article prior to submission, and if someone has not reviewed and agreed the article prior to submission, they should not be included as a co-author, okay? And all the co-authors need to understand that this is part of the deal, yeah? And sometimes you get to a point where someone is refusing to agree the final draft of an article, and you have to say, well, I'm going to have to take you off as a co-author. That's rare, but it happens sometimes, and that's because the ICMJE guidance says that someone needs to agree to the final draft before they can be included as a co-author. Yeah. Some journals, the BMJ as an example, make you sign an ICMJE form before you can submit the paper, and that actually includes very specific details on how each author contributed to the paper. So be prepared for that at the outset by making sure that you understand what the criteria for authorship are, the agreed international criteria, agree with your team that you're going to adhere to these, and making sure that you understand the ways in which everybody's contributed. People often find it by the time they've done all of this that they're over their word count. I often joke with colleagues that my superpower is finding the 2,000 words in an article that aren't needed. But I have actually quite easily taken 2,000 words off an article over the course of 3 or 4 hours just by knowing what to look for and by applying particular rules. So it's worth saying that you can say absolutely whatever you need to say in however many words you're given. If you're given 100 words, right, you can say whatever you need to say if you're absolutely clear on what it is that you want to say to your readership. Okay. People sometimes say, well, I can't present my findings in the way that I want in 3,000 words. Well, that may be true. Maybe you need 5,000 words, but there are compromises to be made. So if you want to publish in the journal that has a word limit of 3,000 words, then you're going to have to make compromises about what goes into your article. If you're prepared to publish in a different journal that has a 5,000 word cutoff, then by all means do that, but recognize the compromises that you're making. If a journal specifies a word count, stick to the word count. It will not be accepted by the journal unless you've met their word count criteria. Sometimes you can get special editorial permission to deviate from this. So I recently had permission from the editor of Age and Aging to submit a 5,000 word article about a piece of developmental work rather than their standard 3,000 word limit. But I had to ask for particular permission to do this. Editors have a bit more flexibility now that journals are predominantly online. They don't have a page budget in the same way that they used to, but only deviate from the word count if you've got special editorial permission. If you don't, chances are that they will simply reject your article and tell you to go away and take out some words. How do you reduce word count? Well, think again of your target audience and what you really need to tell them. If it's not something that you really need to tell them, if it's not something they really need to know, then it can come out. Do they really need all of that background, or are you telling them things that they already know? Is some of your discussion actually pontification rather than being central to the message? If you find that you're up on your soapbox talking about hobby horses, then get off your soapbox and take some of that stuff out and just focus on what it is that your readers really need to know about your article under the 4 headings that I gave you for the discussion. Are there any bits of methods, methodology, or results that can be shifted to an appendix? Sometimes by moving a section to an appendix or to a supplementary table, you can find yourself a good 500 or even 1,000 words. And then look for the words the and a. You'll usually find that there are about 300 or 400 examples of the word "the" and "a" in an article, particularly if it's written by a relatively inexperienced author. And you will find when you look at them closely that most of them are not needed. And in most papers I can find, as I say, between 400 and 500 words simply by taking the word "the" out of the article wherever that I see it. Okay, so those are just some tips. If you are over word count, you're aiming for that 3,000 word journal and you want to get down to it, how to do it. A few words about submission. Make sure that before submission that your authors know when the article is going to be locked down and when it has been locked down. If you tell them it's going to be locked down at noon on Monday, I'm not accepting contributions after then they cannot complain if they come to you at 1 o'clock on Monday and you say it's too late. Okay, so just be absolutely clear about when it's been locked down. And when you've locked it down, just say the article is now locked down. I'm not accepting any further amendments. Ideally do this a day or two before submission, just so that if someone does come through with a last minute thing and it's past your lockdown, when you have a bit of discretion as to whether you're going to let them off the hook or not. It will depend upon how important their last minute contribution is. Make sure before you go to do the submission that you check all your co-authors' affiliations. Many of them will have more than one affiliation. I often use 3, one for my university, one for my trust, and one for the applied research collaboration. Make sure that you know their middle initials, what they stand for. Some journals will ask for their middle names to be written in full. Some journals will ask for post-nominals, by which they mean qualifications. For some of them, that will be all of their qualifications. For other, that will be their most high-ranking post-nominal. Make sure you have the post-nominals that the journal require and which one the authors regard to be their most high-ranking one. For most authors, that will be their PhD or MD if they have one of those. Yeah. Journals increasingly look for ORCID numbers. If your co-authors have ORCID numbers, get these from them in advance. If they don't have an ORCID, tell them to go and get one. If they're writing papers on a regular basis, they're going to need one of these. It will help people keep track of their publications. If they're a clinician that's only dipping in and out of writing, or they're a member of the public, they might not need an ORCID. But if there's someone that's writing even occasionally, then just tell them to go and get one and include that in the submission. Clear time in your diary to submit. I can now do this with enough preparation in a couple of hours, but it used to take me about half a day. And really, it's important to allow your time enough time and headspace to get this done. Yeah, so I'd allow yourself an afternoon for submission, if I'm honest, to make sure that you do this in a kind of quiet, calm, and methodical way, so that people aren't distracting you whilst you're doing something that's quite detail orientated. And then read the formatting requirements again for the journal before you go to the manuscript central page to submit it. They're often very, very specific. And even then, when you've read them a last time, be prepared to have gotten them wrong. So every single time I've submitted to the BMJ, despite the fact I've done it numerous times now, I always seem to miss something off or do something in a slightly different order from I did it the last time, and I always have to change it. So try to get them as close as possible, but be prepared for the fact that it might take you 2 or 3 attempts to actually get the submission in line with what the journal expects. So these were the overarching questions that I put at the beginning. Who are your target audience? What do you want to tell them? And how best can you get that message across? Everything I've told you through this has really been with those in mind. Always important to remember that the fundamental thrust of research is to make impact on the real world. And if you keep this in your head, this is not an exercise in kind of sophistry. It's not about appearing to be clever. It's not about appearing to be a scholarly, chin-stroking academic. It's about making a difference to your target audience in the real world. Then that will help you stay on track and help you to write an article that really makes a difference. And if you write an article that really makes a difference, it's much more likely to get published. And then I'd finish with this message, which I had at the beginning. Again, most of what I've said to you here is stuff that I learned a decade and a half ago when I was writing a PhD. I've become more convinced over time that these fundamental basics about keeping this simple are absolutely at the heart of good academic writing. So there's nothing that I've said today that's particularly rocket science, but it is worth getting the basics right. And if you do, your chances of getting published and your chances of your article being read, cited, and making a difference once published will be really substantially greater. Thank you very much for your time. I've managed to fill almost the entire time thanks to my digital assistant cutting me out in the middle. But I think we do have time for a couple of questions just before we finish. Over to Emma.
We absolutely do. Thank you, Adam. I will be removing all my the, and ands out of my grant submission this afternoon to try and meet the word limit. So questions for Adam, if anybody's got any.
As always, I don't mind if not.
That's say have a few hours. Brian Cox, by the way, do you read?
Madeline reminded me. You have a mental blank when you're saying something. And please don't think I'm suffering from early dementia.
That's right. I just had visions of Baz Luhrmann popping up. Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, for that really brilliant presentation. I just wanted to ask around like picking journals, really. Like, how do you go about making sure that the journals that you're trying to submit to are relevant to the field, really?
Yes, I mean, I think if it's your own field, you know what your kind of peer group and what your colleagues read. Yeah, so I publish in Aging a lot of targeting geriatricians and rehabilitationists because I know increasingly that's what they read. Right, anybody that's a member of the British Geriatric Society gets free access to that. They get it into their mailbox in a monthly period. If I'm aiming for something kind of high impact, aiming at medics, the Lancet's always good, although it's phenomenally difficult to get published in. But the BMJ is read by almost every medic because it comes with the British Medical Association membership. If I'm not sure, if I'm writing in something that's that's new to me, for example, I publish for primary care doctors occasionally, and I remember not being sure whether they really genuinely read the British Journal of General Practice or whether they really read Family Practice. So actually, just writing to some of my stakeholders, just sending them an email going, "Which of these journals do your colleagues actually regularly read?" And they told me, what it was that they read. I remember publishing some stuff around, service redesign and speaking to some NHS managers and saying, where should I publish? And they say, well, don't publish an academic paper at all. Publish a kind of news article in the Health Services Journal because that's what we read. Yeah. So instead, I went and spoke to a journalist at the Health Services Journal and got something in there. So I think working with your stakeholders, working at what it is that they read, working at how best they like to receive the information to deliver the type of change you're looking for is helpful in making your selections. And then sometimes you find, particularly when it's new research, particularly when it's PhD research, and it therefore is maybe not, PhD research we all like to think is earth-shattering, but it's often a quite small contribution. And sometimes you find that you have to shop around a bit. And so having a first, second and third choice journal is not a bad idea, so that when you get your first one rejecting you, and we've all been there, even with quite big bits of research. I've had multi-million-pound grants that have been rejected by a journal that I actually thought was slightly getting above its station. Just be prepared to have a second and third choice because it happens to all of us. And I say the issue with rejections is read why they've rejected it. If they're making solid points, don't get proud. Make the modifications, make the amendments. If they're making what seem like slightly tangential points, then don't turn yourself inside out trying to rewrite an article that you think is pretty solid. Just resubmit it somewhere else, reformatted. Hopefully that's helpful.
You've got one last question as a comment I can refer to. So Aaron's asked about open access or open versions of journals such as BMJ Open, and your thoughts on that. I guess it refers back to the last thing about stakeholders, and another point about promoting on publications on social media afterwards. Absolutely. Come and listen to Ollie on Monday.
Yeah, I promote everything I do in social media. So if any of you want to see how I use social media, feel free to just follow me. We've got a few publications coming through in the next couple of months. It's one of the great things for social media is the ability to hit a large audience. And there's something called the alt metric now. And I actually cite my alt metric for some of my top articles. And the alt metric, which is hidden down the side of most journals, is actually your social media footprint from your article. And that's another metric you can cite about your article's impact. And the thing about open access journals, we're moving gradually towards a world where some funders will only fund your research if you publish open access. Yeah. Now, at the moment, that's a gold open access funding model, which means that you have to pay open access fees. Universities are increasingly paying in block contracts for open access. So what I would say is, yes, by all means, go for open access. BMJ Open is a slightly kind of lower impact version of the BMJ. You have to just think if it's going to hit your target audience or not. I published loads in BMJ Open over the years because it's the one that I thought was the best way to get to my target audience. If it's not the right way to get to your target audience, choose something else. But wherever you publish, try to go for open access. Try to go for one that your university or your NHS trust will allow you to publish open access and for free because they've already got a block contract. If it's going to cost some money, work out where the money's coming from before you submit the paper, because there's nothing more soul destroying than having the paper accepted than realizing that you cannot afford the £2,400 open access fee. So work out how much it's going to cost and work out how you're going to pay for it.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Adam. So I'd say, yeah, brilliant advice there. The best one, I think, closing with just check people can afford open access fees because it's really, really tricky. And lots of universities haven't got the cash to support them at the moment. We've just been fighting to try and get one funded that's probably taken 6 weeks worth of emails. So yeah, just to invest in what resources are there, and also for open access, it's not just for you as authors, it's for your readership as well. So lots of the journals are behind firewalls, so if you want to get to a particular stakeholder audience, check that they can see where you're publishing. Right, thank you, Adam.
Sure.
Whistle stop tour.
Yeah.
We will put this all on our YouTube channel, so people can come back and look at all your QR codes and all your tips as well.
Good. Thanks everyone for your attention, and
Thanks
good luck
all.
with your writing.
Thank you.
Bye.